Welcome to today's episode of the SADF podcast. Our theme is Haunted Histories, Violence, Memory, and Justice in Sri Lanka. We will be exploring how historical narratives, collective memory, and the pursuit of justice intersect in the Sri Lankan context, and what these dynamics mean for peace building and reconciliation. Joining us today is Andi Schubert, a PhD researcher at the University of Cambridge, and his work focuses on the politics of memory and the ways in which histories of violence shape contemporary debates on justice and accountability. His research offers critical insights into how societies remember and sometimes forget their most difficult pasts. Co hosting this conversation with me is Natasha Fernando, SADF Junior Fellow, who brings her expertise on South Asian peace building and transitional justice to the discussion. Together, we will unpack the complexities of Sri Lanka's haunted histories and ask, how do narratives of violence influence the present? What role does memory play in shaping justice? And what lessons can be drawn for the future? So, welcome, Andy.
Thanks, Tapas. Thank you for having me, and thank you so much for the invitation to you, both you and Natasha. It's great to be here. Thank you.
So I will ask the very basic question about how do you define the haunted history of Sri Lanka, or when we use the term, what pops up into your mind for the first time?
I mean, that's a great question. I think for me, I've come to see Sri Lanka as a place that is haunted by many different kinds of, I mean, I guess the English term would be ghosts. In Sinhala, we might say yakku, preteo, bhuteo, holmang, and a variety of different terms. That doesn't really quite translate into ghosts, but, there are a variety of different things and what these different things mean. But I've come to see Sri Lanka as a space that is dealing with essentially restless spirits, spirits that have not been laid to rest. And that covers across a span of things that include colonial encounters across a variety, a range of times, but also our post colonial histories, particularly in terms of the war and the violence that we've experienced in the country. So I think for me, definitely Sri Lanka is very much a space that is haunted by all these violence, for one, but also the fact that this violence has never been addressed, right? And that calls for accountability, those calls for justice continue throughout politics, our society, and they come up in various different ways, in ways that we can't get past. And so for me, when I think of haunted histories, I think of, a space which is in dire need of justice. And for me, that's one way of thinking about what haunting does.
Thank you, Dakshin. I contacted the PhD candidate from Cambridge University based on an article that I came across when I was doing my bibliography, which was Restless Somnambulist Reflections on Violence, Accountability, and Historical Practice from Sri Lanka, which was published through a history workshop at the University of Cambridge. And it fascinated me because it is about Sri Lanka, which is a country that I'm studying as a Sri Lankan. And to hear from somebody who is a historian that is using the second person narrative in history, which is a very under researched position in history. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about your work, your PhD at the Cambridge University.
I was really surprised when I got your email. I was like, oh wow, someone's reading this piece. When I was writing the piece, somebody asked me what would be your measure of success for the piece, and I was like, if it gets published. And the History Workshop Journal was really kind enough to publish it. If it has a kind of indirect relationship to the work that I'm doing. My PhD is around the questions of time and decolonization in Sri Lanka, particularly between the period of 1948 and 1956, which for those of us who are familiar with Sri Lanka would know it marks kind of bookends two key moments. One is independence from British rule, but I'm also specifically interested in the Citizenship Acts, through which what we now know as the Malayaha community, and at the time they're referred to as an Indian Tamil community. But I think the preferred self-descriptor for the community is Malayaha Tamil. The community was disenfranchised and made stateless. One of the earliest acts of the post-colonial Sri Lankan state. So that happened in 1948 and 1949. And then in 1956, of course, we had Sinhala only as kind of an act that was passed, making Sinhala the language of the majority, the only official language of the country. And in many accounts of Sri Lanka's civil war, that's kind of a key moment, a turning point. And so it's a very short period in some ways, but I think there's so much happening. And so one of the ways in which I think about this project as being is 1948 and 1956 are moments that haunt each other. But I think when you think about questions of time, because history in some ways is a thinking about time, the question of the ghost really plays around with time, right? Like the ghost is in a sense out of time. That's what defines a ghost. And for me, there is kind of a different way of thinking about history itself. If we start thinking with ghosts and we don't see then a kind of very easy distinction between past, present, and future, because the ghost in a sense breaks down all those demarcations that we have, right, between past, present, and future. So they are connected indirectly. But I think for me also quite directly, I was coming out of working in English studies and into history. And so this is one of the first pieces I wrote in my PhD. And I think it was also a way of working out what that transition meant in some ways. You all have very kindly described me as a historian. And I'm still not sure about that. It's a kind of a identification that I'm still in the process of becoming comfortable with. It still sits uneasily on me because I feel like the kind of questions I'm asking are really important questions about what this does to how we think about history. If we start thinking about ghosts, right? And what does it do for how we think about conventional history, and then what matters to us?
I understand that it is a huge transition for you to graduate from English and then at the PhD level to just switch disciplines into history, which is a major transition. Like, I understand that because I studied international relations law. And then for my PhD, I started in religion, which was a major disciplinary change, a major change in the domain of studies. So, one of the first things, my first PhD seminar was it was taught by Professor Eve Packet. It was on this question of a researcher's positionality. How would you position yourself in relation to the object of your study? And how would you define your privilege? This I struggled a lot with to understand and to define. It took so much of my time, energy, and effort, and I was up in the night thinking about this. And this has been, it is troublesome to think of something that deep at the onset of a PhD program, especially when you've switched disciplines and your domain of studies. So, which is why I wanted to have this discussion with you. When I read this article, where I see a lot of dramatization and I can see your literature background reflected in this article when you were writing about the KFC buckets and Galaraku, and you made all these references to things that I could relate with, and a lot of Sri Lankans would actually reach out to you and about this article because it relates to us in so many different ways. So I just want to hear a little bit more about how, as a historian, you would define your positionality and privilege in terms of what you study.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. Those are really big questions, right? Like there are no easy answers to those questions, and I think it's something I constantly grapple with. I think if you ask me this question again in another year, I might have a different answer to it, and I'd like to think that I arrogate to myself that perhaps privilege, to use that to change my mind later on and to reframe this later. But for me, I guess a couple of things in response to your question. One is that I think for me, I've started to think of privilege as not having to think about things, right? And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Many years ago, when I was still an undergraduate, I think we both went to the same university in Sri Lanka. I was part of a research, somebody's PhD research, and they asked me, how do you identify yourself as a man? And I just completely could not answer that question. And because it was never something I had to think about, right? And that's part of the privilege of being a man, right? Like you never have to say, how do you know that you're a man, right? Whereas I think for a lot of women, like the question of what it means to be a woman, society is constantly putting that question in front of them, right? Whether it be in terms of marriage, in terms of children, in terms of, I mean, that's just very heteropatriarchal in its own sense, right? But like in so many different ways, society pushes a certain agenda for women in ways that it doesn't push for men. And so I've increasingly come to think about privilege as being something where you don't have to think about it. And so unless someone comes along and asks you, like, for example, someone asked me, like, how do you identify yourself as a man, right? Like, you're not really going to think about it. So for me personally, I think, so that's one answer to that question. I think also in a lot of ways, this question of positionality and privilege is also shaped by questions like, how we deal with it reflexively, right? I'm increasingly inspired by some of the work and the conversations that are happening in anthropology, which is a discipline which has thought a lot about privilege and positionality, right? In ways that perhaps history has not. Right? It's only now that I think in Sri Lanka, we don't have these conversations, right? We take them for granted. And I think what's really interesting about some of the conversations going on in anthropology right now is also questions about how does this kind of reflection about reflexivity change you? So there are so many different ways in which I have privilege. But I think I also, when I was on my way here, I had to kind of also come to terms with the fact that there was ways in which privilege was also assumed of me that I can't get past, but also privilege that is assumed of me, right? Which is a little bit of a different conversation to positionality, right? Because positionality is something you reflect on for yourself, but then there's also positionality in terms of what people assume your positionality is. And I've felt this a lot for me, like thinking and working, particularly as a minority, in a space like Sri Lanka, in a lot of ways in which people make assumptions about what my ethnic identifications are. And I mean, I have a name like Schubert, right? Like, so people presume that, at best that I'm a burger. And then my spoken Sinhala is passable. People then might not sometimes recognize me as being a minority, right? That allowed me certain privileges, particularly during the war, to navigate through spaces that people who had Tamil backgrounds, for example, would not be able to navigate. But at the same time, in other contexts, like, people would not see me as a minority was coming into spaces and asking questions, like coming out of an experience of being a minority in a place like Sri Lanka, which is very, as you know, Natasha, very identity conscious. Ethnicity matters, right? So, well, like, you constantly try to figure out where you fit, right? In which box. I try to avoid affirming any box. And so that makes it complicated. So I always kind of feel like I'm navigating how people are trying to fit me into a box. So that's also kind of been part of the work, is to also think through that. But also, like, in general, to the question of research, I think research is a tremendously extractive process. And I don't think there's any way, for me personally, there's any way that I could do research that is not extractive. And there is a great deal of privilege in being a researcher. And I think you can't get rid of that. You can't say that's going to go away or that's doesn't matter. It matters a lot, right, to the work that we want to do. And I think we need to also grapple with that. We need to wrestle with it as something that's not going away. That's something that colors our work, right? Like, for me, there is no subaltern positionality in being a researcher. You're already at a position of privilege in just the dynamic of the work. And I think you can do is be honest about it rather than say, I'm not this or I'm not that. Just, it is privilege. And so I think that's true of any research, but that's just me.
That's an excellent set of reflections coming from you, and I believe Tapas might have some questions for you. Uh,
I just wanted to go back to this learning from past, this haunting past. And then you also, in your opening remarks, mentioned about justice, right? That how justice is quite important if we want to forget the haunting experience of the past. So, actually, what kind of justice? Like, I'm from Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, we tried to provide justice to the victims of 1971, but that actually became a huge political debate, which we are even now we are stretching. I was a prosecutor of that tribunal, and that is still the center point of all the political debate, revenge, whatever. I mean, and it's itself a threat. But this justice process itself is a threat to the whole democracy in Bangladesh. So I'm really curious to know from you that what kind of justice you want to seek.
Thank you, Tapas. That's a really great question. I think part of this work is also thinking about, one of the kind of inspirations for this paper, provocations perhaps more accurately, is Shehan Karunatilaka's Seven Moons of Mali Almeida, which people may have read in this iteration after it won the Booker Prize. A previous edition of it was published in South Asia as Chats with the Dead. And in that version of the work, the ending is quite different. What I find really, really interesting about that previous edition is it poses this question that you're asking. In a sense, the main character has to make a choice, right? What kind of justice do I want to pursue? Because in a sense, the novel presents the main character with three different options. One is to just move on, forget about it, move on, right? The other is something like revenge, which you kind of alluded to, right? And in a sense, that this is the kind of challenge the character faces, right? Like, how do you do this, right? The character seems to be going down one path. Things seem to be flowing towards that. And then suddenly these two kind of seemingly opposite modes end up in conflict with each other, where the pursuit of revenge means that it'll affect the people you love. And then can you still make the same choice? Right? Can you still say, you know what, it's fine, I've let go, what happens, happens. I think when we think about justice, we need to make space for different ways in which people imagine justice, and that not all forms of imagination of justice are the same. I think that's the strange thing about working with ghosts, right? Is that, some ghosts are not going to be laid to rest. Some ghosts are not going to give up their claims for justice. Some ghosts are going to keep haunting us. We can beg, we can cajole, we can plead to be released from those demands, but they may not. When we think about a question like justice, it's easy to say that I'm not giving you a direct answer, right? Like when you want to say, like, what does justice look like to me? I think it's not straightforward because different communities will answer that question very differently. I think part of what a state tries to do, to speak to your experience through kind of legal processes, is to close that debate, right? To say that we've gone through this kind of legal process. Usually it's a legal process, right? And if we've gone through the legal process, then this conversation is done. Justice has been served. But the figure of the ghost really kind of puts that into question because it's not up to the state. It's not up to the people who are alive even. And I think when we have a conversation about past and haunting and justice, then I think we also need to make space for the fact that there are different ways in which justice is pursued. This is not for me to say, like, I'm fine with, just going and retributively doing whatever you want to people.
And in my research, I have experienced, like, for example, I have studied South Africa, that what Nelson Mandela did, now we are seeing that it is falling apart, right? Trump recently saying that now there is white genocide is taking place over there. So now we are saying turning tables. The same thing that happened in Bangladesh as well. Like we were trying Jamaati Islami for their role in 1971. Now Jamaati Islami is taking some sort of control, and they have turned the table into Awami League for their like alleged activities in the last 15 years. So everywhere there is turning tables, and it seems there is not a single prescription for actually defining justice. Listening to this book, Future of the Ministry of Future, I don't know if any of you have the chance to read it. I haven't finished it, but even this question is asked there, that from the perspective of past experience, what is justice is just frustrating. So I quite understand from where you are coming from, and sometimes it is politically disturbing to answer this kind of questions as well. I mean, back of our mind, we also think about the grand reality and how the answer will be accepted by people. So, moving on to the next question, which is that you were talking about positionality and memory. So, that what role does both positionality and memory play in shaping justice?
In a sense, I think about some work that I did a long time ago, right? Which is that in a lot of transitional justice schemes, there is a presumption that it is very clear who the victim is and who the perpetrator is, right? And if those roles are not clear, things become messy. And one of the kind of questions that I asked, looking at kind of post-war discourse around reconciliation by the Mahinda Rajapaksa regime, was what does it mean to claim to be both victim and victor? And so I titled the paper "Victorious Victims." And you mentioned South Africa, and I think this is true in a lot of spaces, right, where there have been these attempts to deal with atrocities or past crimes and memory and all these questions. That framing becomes really crucial. If you look at South Africa, it is the community that was oppressed that ends up and leads the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? That's also true of Rwanda, where the Gacaca courts are kind of led by Tutsi communities who were the kind of victims of the genocide. But then I think you think of spaces like Sri Lanka, you think of spaces like Chile or Argentina or Guatemala, where basically you have the perpetrators still very much in power. And then transitional justice, or perpetrators, or, in the broad sense, right? Or people who are credibly accused of human rights violations, right? Still in power. And then you're pursuing a transitional justice process in that situation, in that dynamic, right? Then you find yourself dealing with very different claims to what justice means. So in the Sri Lankan case, there was a claim that the LLRC, the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, was the reconciliation mechanism that we were going to use to deal with past accusations of human rights violations. But communities, particularly Tamil communities who were affected by violence, said, no, we don't accept this. Right. And if you look at what has happened in Sri Lanka, in the north, there's been a consistent call for international involvement in accountability. In part, this is a sense that, we cannot expect justice from a state structure that is dominated by the people who made us victims, right? Who made us survivors. And so in that situation, memory becomes really important, because it allows you a way to challenge and resist and negotiate the ways in which the state is framing justice, right? That is just my understanding of it. But I think then these works in which memory persists, and memory persists sometimes in ways that we don't want them to, right? In kind of troubling ways. I mean, I think of, for example, Natasha will be very much more familiar with this in Elephant Pass, right? There's a tank, right? So it was a memorial used by the LTT. And the story was when the LTT overran the camp in Elephant Pass, and Elephant Pass is like the doorway into the north, right? Into the northern peninsula. When it overran the tank, this person kind of tried to resist the overrunning, and then the tank was stopped there. But under the LTTE, the tank was a symbol of their victory. And then when the Sri Lankan army overran the camp and took over the camp, and if you go today to the north, the tank is a symbol of the victory of the Sri Lankan army, the kind of bravery of this Sinhala soldier. So it's the same object used for completely opposite ends, right? To commemorate something completely opposed to each other. And I think this is the funny thing about memory, particularly when it's tied to objects, right? But, and so I think there are ways in which it persists even in the face of claims that justice is served. And the tag is a bit of a, it may be a little bit of an indirect kind of this thing, but I think it also points to the way in which memory is such a tricky, slippery thing, right? But I think perhaps for me, in my work, the way I like to think about it is, what if we start from a position that these claims can't ever be there is no kind of settling of memory and justice. Let's take that start from there, rather than assuming that there is a point at which we can achieve justice, or that there is a point in which memory will trump other things, but rather to see these as things that can never be settled. If we take that as our starting point, then I think the kind of questions we ask in our work, for me, at least in my work, is going to be very different to, just assuming then I can't just prescribe and say, if you do these things, then you will achieve justice. But rather to say, maybe that's not what the point is. The point is to abide with the fact that these things can't ever be settled. And again, that again brings me back to then what haunting does, right? I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult to answer these questions. We can discuss, but nothing will satisfy the question. That's what I understood over the years. Natasha, please. I'm going.
I yes, when I read your article, the one that's titled "Restless Somnambulist: Reflections on Violence and Historical Practice," there's a lot of reference to the JVP insurrections, the Marxist insurrections that happened in Sri Lanka in the 1970s and 1980s, which were led by Sinhalese youth, during which there was state-sponsored violence, disappearances, sexual violence, torture, murder, and all of that. And during this period, there were certain prominent people, or at least they were made famous because of their deaths. One such person is Premawati Manampiri, a young beauty queen from Kataragama, from the south of Sri Lanka, who was assaulted, shot to death for being involved in the uprisings by the military in 1971, which raised a different set of questions about the pursuit of justice in Sri Lanka, especially when the state is seen as the violator and the perpetrator of the crimes that happened. And another reference to Richard de Soisa, who is a famous poet, and we studied Richard de Soisa as part of post-colonial English literature in Sri Lanka. So these two deaths that you've mentioned in your article, I'd actually like to know a little bit more about why you put this into the mainstream in this particular article. How do you feel about those deaths now, looking at it in a different perspective as a historian?
Thanks for that question, Natasha. There is a third site, right, like to this, which you haven't mentioned, which I thought was also interesting, which is Padmasiri and the 17. I mean, there are various. In the article, I talk about 17, but there are variations of it. Some people say 34. But, there were a bunch of people who were killed, who were students who were killed, and their heads were arranged around a pond, right? And we don't really talk about that incident a lot. I like to think, I like to think that these were figures that found me, not figures that I found, and that they were kind of a way of getting at certain questions. I don't think that as a historian, I mean, for one, like Richard de Zoysa is someone who I'm very interested in. He's not just a poet, right? Like, I mean, of course, we know him now as a poet, but like, in his lifetime, he was known as a lot of things. He was a journalist, which may have been what got him killed, right? But he was also actor. He played this role in this famous film Yugante, which is a remake of a novel by Martin Wickremesinghe. But he was a lot of things, and I don't think that I was necessarily after Richard de Zoysa, the historical figure. But I think, or even Premawati Manamperi, the historical figure. But I do think that they were really interesting ways of. It's really hard for me to talk about this article, Natasha, because I mean, when I read it, I was rereading it for this podcast, and I was like, "Who wrote this? I don't know this person." I mean, it sounds like a really interesting article. I'd love to meet them, whoever wrote this. And because I wrote this really fast, right? And these were just figures that came to me that I felt haunted by. I mean, I honestly feel like if I reflect on the process of writing this, it was a really almost kind of strange ritual of like a seance or something like that. Because like I sat down, I had this idea and then I started writing and I wrote it in 2.5 days. And I couldn't stop myself. And it was written. And then I suddenly it was over. Right. And so these were figures that I felt like, and I'm not joking when I say this, that found me. It's not that I found them. They were not like convenient vehicles to tell a story, but they were really figures that helped me to reflect on what violence meant. And of course, it helps that lives and violence that these figures met, people are more, it's more accessible to people, right? Like people know Richard's story, for example, or Premavati Manamperi's story might be better known. The story of the students is not as well known, right? And I think, I mean, I was not at Peradeniya, but I can imagine the experience of walking into campus one day and seeing the heads of people you know arranged around a central point of the university, right? That it would have been like such a crazy experience, right? And it's so far out to even say it now. It sounds like I'm making it up, right? And I just felt like these are figures that allow us to think about, what is this violence doing? And can there ever be justice? And part of writing that article was to ask the question, we are a country that has so much, like, we think of ourselves having so much history. We have ruins, we have all these written texts, great temples, great monuments. It's very much part of our lives. And then we have all this crazy violence. And what does it mean to live with this, where you have too much history on the one hand and never enough accountability? Of course, these are stories that we perhaps know better. But I think in the piece, hopefully, people read it differently. There's also a sense that perhaps these are just figures we know, but there are so many others, right? That don't get named, that don't get the kind of attention that these figures get, but who also lost their lives, who also go through violence, who are also dealing with these, who are still restless, right? Like who are not been laid to rest. And perhaps, though we may not know, or I may not know all of them, for their families, for sure, these are still very much present, right? They're not gone away. They are very much part of things that haunt them, right, on their daily lives. And in a sense, these figures become then a way to enter into that conversation, rather than saying, it's only Richard that matters, or it's only Premavati Manamperi who matters, but as stand-ins for those figures who may not have that kind of recognition. That would be my kind of long-winded response to you, Natasha, but I'm happy to continue the conversation.
I just have more of a commentary to offer rather than a question. That is to basically agree with what Andy explained throughout this podcast when he spoke about unresolved justice and haunted histories. It's just that in Sri Lanka, I've been part of the Missing Valentine's Day, which was organized by the Office for Reparations in Sri Lanka in Colombo, where there were families from all sides of the conflict. There were Sinhalese, Muslims, and Tamils who were there just to make a point to the government that they've not received reparations or justice for the people that went missing during the civil war, during the insurrections, and even before that, during numerous instances of mass violence in Sri Lanka. So when we as researchers we approach this topic of memory justice and we frame it in this larger discourse of transitional justice, it's a never ending set of questions and there's no clear answer. And our positions that we take is something that evolves as we study and we encounter new experiences. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Tapas to see if you have any other reflections on the subject matter, or if you want to wrap up our conversation for today.
My commentary is quite aligned with both of you. However, the memory which is haunting us, we either have to, like Andy said, either we will seek for accountability or we have to make peace with it. There is, because the moment you want to scratch this old wound, it will become, it will be bleeding more. That is what is the situation, but that doesn't mean that we will not seek justice. That doesn't mean that we will stop our endeavors. So Andy, once again, thank you very much. So uh, that brings us to the end of today's discussion on haunted histories, violence, memory, and justice in Sri Lanka. We explored how the weight of a haunted past and the politics of memory shape our understanding of justice. not just as a legal concept, but as a deeply contested moral and historical one. Our conversation highlighted the uncomfortable truth that the state itself can often be a violator of human rights, and Sri Lanka's experience reminds us how difficult it is to reconcile accountability with power. Big thank you to our guest Andy Schubert for sharing his insights and helping us navigate these complex questions. And thank you to my co host, Natasha Fernando, for steering this dialogue with such depth and clarity.
Thank you, Andy, once
Yeah.
again for
Thank you
participating.
so much for thank you so much for having me. It's been really fantastic.
Thank you. So, dear viewers, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the SADF podcast and share it with anyone interested in peace building, justice, and South Asian affairs. Until next time, let's keep asking the hard questions and keep the conversation going. Thank you very much.